Welcome to Creation to Restoration, the podcast that explores behind the scenes of the biblical timeline. With your hosts, Randall Owens and Andy Patt.
Well, good morning, Andy. How are we doing today?
Good, Randall. Morning. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Listen, I'm pretty excited to be getting into today's podcast. We're back in Genesis, of course, which is right where we started, 2 weeks ago. This being our third podcast, episode 3, and we are talking about creation, and we are at the very beginning. We started Genesis 1:1, and we talked about the gap theory a little bit last week, and then we talked about the day-age theory a little bit, and why we don't think those things are valid, and we believe that the earth was created in 6 days. And on the seventh day, God rested. Is that right, Andy?
That's what the Bible says. So, if you want to take it, at its word, and frankly, when, like we talked about, Christ talks about our salvation, I like to take him at his word.
Yes.
I feel like a uniform principle applies. And it's not just here. It's Exodus, like we talked about. It's other places. So, that's kind of the baseline point that we start out with. And unless what we discover is so arbitrary, like so massively contradictory to everything else that we see, there's not really a reason to go back and change that foundational point. So that's where we start.
That's great. That's great. So as we look at, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then we get to Genesis 1:2, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. What is going on there?
Yeah. So, well, let's start with 1:1, the very first one. So there is an analogy that I like to use when it comes to kind of trying to understand what's going on here, because it helps, especially when we get to chapter 2 and some of the things that people might perceive as contradictions. So I think getting the right framework and the frame of mind helps getting started. So,
okay. All right.
I would say that the kind of what we're dealing with, the scene that we're dealing with, is like a builder. So when you are going to decide to make a house and you're going to get building your new house, you got to find a piece of land. You got to determine when the project starts. You got to get the materials for the project in order to do the building, right? And so you bring all of that to that space. And I think Genesis 1:1 is essentially God the builder showing up at the time where he's going to begin, in the beginning, and then laying out the foundations for that project. So when we look at Genesis 1:1, and this is important when we think about how things have to work in order for it to work, it's really laid out in a very particular order, and God's setting the stage for the initiation of creation. So nothing pre-existed apart from God himself. And so we have in the beginning, which is the creation of time, God,
All right,
who is the builder, created heaven, which is the space, the plot of land. This is the space in which he's going to build, and the earth. So this is essentially the bringing into existence of all the raw materials needed. So all matter is created. So you have time, space, and matter all now coming to the scene before God the builder to begin the creation.
So you have a when, and you have a what, right? And you have a who.
A who and a where.
And a where.
Yeah,
okay,
exactly,
all right,
yeah.
okay.
So, and what's crazy is, too, we think about so this is the starting of the universe. What does universe mean? Uni, singular, verse, single spoken sentence. So our universe is all now culminating in a single spoken sentence. God created the heavens and the earth.
Wow, that's that's awesome to think about.
Yeah.
Again, say that one more time. The universe, uni meaning one,
Yep.
verse meaning
A spoken sentence.
spoken sentence, and so it all comes together in the first sentence. The first words of the Bible in Genesis 1:1, you see all of that happening in universe.
Yes. So the universe created a single uni spoken sentence verse. You have, there we go, boom. So if you want to say there's a big bang, then I would say, yeah, God said it and bang, it happened. That's about all we're going to go into that theory on that, though. So, yeah.
Yeah, that is kind of crazy, though. We won't chase that rabbit, but yeah, that's that is a really good way to describe what God did.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's a great way to kind of get the idea of where do we start. I mean, you start with having a place, a time, and what to build with. So,
yeah.
And that gets us, that informs, I think, our position when we see Genesis 2 coming up. So, we say that the earth was without form and void, darkness upon the face of the deep. When we talked last week about the idea that some would perceive that to mean it became without form and void, i.e. you had form, it was filled, and then something broke it. That's where the gap theory starts as their premise.
Right.
Whereas the way I read it, plainly in terms of the building project is it is yet unformed and unfilled. both interpretations work with the exact words. So now we're talking about where's your foundational worldview, where's your starting point, how do you read it, and that's going to inform how you interpret that more than one person's more right or more wrong with regards to the language itself. So that's the way I see it. The earth was unformed, unfilled, darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. That word moved, it's like brooded, like his essence, his presence was there. The builder is on scene beginning to form his project. So that's kind of how I see the starting of this whole thing taking place.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So we see the Spirit of God. He's moving on the face of the deep and over the face of the waters here. Now, if we jump down to 3 through 5, or just to 3, it said, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. So here's a question, and this is maybe jumping ahead. If it is, tell me it's jumping ahead too far.
No, you're good. You're good. We're still day one, so we're not too far ahead.
Exactly. Well, this is going to jump ahead a little bit because and let there be light, and there was light. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, it didn't say anything about the sun.
Correct.
So what's being described here? What light has been created? Is it the sun? Is it not the sun?
Gotcha. Yeah. So when we look at kind of the basic understanding of physics and what creation is, like time, space, matter, none of that is a full picture because there's also energy. So energy and Newton related these with kind of the creation, energy and matter cannot be created or destroyed. They get converted one to another. So God's now charging the system. So the energy is being applied. So when we look at, say God said, let there be light, essentially this is the charging of the universe, the adding in of the energy required for all of these processes and for the things that he's going to implement with regards to how fine-tuned and how everything is set up. So that's basically the beginning there. And when we think about God as being light, you don't necessarily need a separate light source, because if God is essentially, then if we think about it and equate it to as like energy, so as far as he is in the universe, he is like this unmovable, unstoppable, overwhelming source of energy. And from his voice was everything created. So when we think about what it takes to build anything, we're always inputting energy into that to build it. And so God is ultimately the energy source, the source of the light. And so when he says let there be, it is his essence filling and charging and powering the universe.
That's an awesome thought. That this is God putting himself into this as the dynamic force that's going to be moving everything. Right, it's going to be bringing everything forth. Right, well, that's awesome.
Yep. And this ties into when we talk about the format for the rest of this creation passage. There is a common phrase that these wrap up with. So we see at the end of Genesis 1, 3 through 5, he says, God called the light day, the darkness he called night. Evening and morning were the first day. So that evening and morning, this is more than speaking to a simple, sun going up, sun going down kind of a situation.
Right, because at this point, is there a sun?
Nope.
Exactly. So, I mean, how many times have we read that, and that's never crossed our mind? Oh, yes, evening and morning were the first day. And it's like, oh, hang on a second. What gives us evening and morning? The sun coming up, the sun going down? This is how we understand those things. And there it is, what looks to be an English plain text that doesn't make any sense now.
Right.
If we stop and think about it.
Exactly.
So there must be more going on in that phrase when it says, and the evening and morning were the first day. What's going on there?
Yeah, so the conversation here gets down to what are the words, what's the Hebrew root of what was being shown here. So Erev and Boker are the two words for evening and morning that we see. And they became synonymous with evening and morning because of what they describe, not because they are the given word for that exact thing, for that exact phenomenon of the sun going up, sun coming down. So Erev, it derives its meaning from obscuration. So it conveys encroaching darkness, which makes one unable to discern forms, shapes, or identities, and it has ties to increasing entropy, increasing disorder and chaos. Boker then being the opposite. So it derives its meaning from becoming discernible. So it describes the breaking forth of light to bring relief to obscurity and to bring about perception and order. So it denotes a decrease in entropy or moving from chaos to order. So when it says evening and morning was the first day, Erev and Boker was the first day, it's talking about essentially the kind of that charging. We're going from chaos to order. The flat, bland state of everything as God charges begins to form it, because it started unformed, unfilled. As he begins to form, he is now really kind of winding up the clock. He is putting things in place. He is creating from this just blank canvas something that is organized and orderly and discernible.
That's really a very different thought. You're just thinking, sundown to sun up.
Right. Well, and it wouldn't make sense, because what's a day?
That's exactly
a
right.
day isn't from sun. That's just the night part. So that's not describing a day even. So
That's right.
It should be a clue as to not that the writer was silly, but that there's something else being said.
Yeah. Evening and morning were the first day. Wait a minute. Evening to morning would be the first night if you were taking it in our modern English understanding of it. So none of that's correct in modern English. You have to understand the Hebrew. And what do we talk about? What is the backstory? What is the context? And this is the context. As the Hebrew writer's writing this, he's understanding from chaos to order is what happened on the first day.
Right.
And it continues to happen as God continues to create.
And there's a very, very technical aspect that we won't dive into, but this is something I've seen graphed out really cleverly by certain folks. I believe Missler was one of the people who had presented something like this. But this comes when we get to where we are today and beginning to understand things in quantum physics. We start to see what it is that's going on with the speed of light, with the relationship to energy and light and matter, and with the Planck's constant and some of the things that Planck discovered. There's more going on in the fabric of all of this. And what we're seeing is a decay, and where a lot of these quote-unquote constants aren't constant, they're inversely proportional. And this is something that when we talk about Erev and Boker, from chaos to order, basically God is setting everything up to perfection, and it's working towards perfection. That perfection maintains until a wrinkle in the story emerges, which we'll get into shortly. And then essentially, as God is no longer there in so much as like he is the core essence, as he has to separate himself from the creation to an extent, from humanity, and work towards the redemption, there begins to be a decaying in the process. And so what we're measuring and what we're seeing today is the effects of the decay, the position we are in relation to the time that's passed and how much has decayed. So when we pick up a rock and try to date it or something, for that instance, we're taking for granted that things have always remained the same. And the Bible even warns that in the last days people will presume that all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. But in fact, when you factor in the decay process, when we're no longer, God took it from Erev to Boker, we're going Boker to Erev. We're going the opposite direction now.
Right, exactly.
And now we got to adjust our calculations for these things.
Yeah. That is a great concept to think that God took from chaos to order, and everything that mankind has done almost from the beginning is to go from God's order to turn it into chaos.
Yeah.
And we see that over and over again as the enemy, as we get, weeks and months into this podcast, and we're going to start talking about all the forces of evil and the other spiritual beings that are trying to create chaos. Yep. It's going counterproductive to what God was trying to do in the beginning.
Exactly.
And again, God will have his way. It rules over everything, but we see that the enemy is always trying to bring chaos into things. And that's true in our lives. Every day, the enemy wants nothing but chaos and disorder.
Yes,
and so when we have to recognize, wait a minute, God is the God of order, and God is bringing things into order, and man and the enemy are just constantly trying to bring chaos.
Right.
And so understanding that's a huge deal of keeping us in alignment with God.
Absolutely. And that it kind of gets to individually as well. We see, because we're so marred by the chaos, because we're so corrupt in our birth and through our sin, one of the ways that Jesus talks about our salvation is this idea that we are becoming a new creation. And then when we get to the end of the story, we see that he makes a full new creation.
That's right.
And really, this thing is going to spiral out until it's burned away, our flesh is burned up, and then we're given new bodies, a new home. So we're seeing God build perfection, and then we see what sin does to it, and then we see God reform, rebuild perfection again. So it's this process of getting to what was originally made to his fully completed plan with his full family, with everything there, and with sin being dealt with.
You know, it's interesting to me when we think, and I know we digress a little bit, but hey, we got nothing but time. We're going to be doing this until Jesus returns, right?
Yeah.
But as we think about, God's not afraid to start again. Again, we look at the end of Revelation, new heaven, new earth. Just like, okay, let's do this again. And when you look at the flood, okay, let's start again. You look at the Tower of Babel, okay, let's start again. He continues to restart his plan to move towards what he wants. And he's okay with that. Again, he's way more patient than we can ever comprehend being.
Yeah, and patience, I think, is the big thing that you take away from that, because it's not so much that God got caught off guard and goes, oh man, how are we going to fix this?
Not at all.
He's seen it from the beginning. You know, it says Christ was slain before the foundations of the earth were laid. So the idea, though, is that because the enemy is so actively trying to mess it up, and because God is consistently giving us a choice to serve him or to serve the enemy,
that's a big deal.
He is setting the chessboard so that, you know, there is a point at which the pieces are reset. Yes, there's kind of a new start, a restart, because ultimately he's sovereign over the outcomes. This is true on the largest and the smallest scales.
Yep.
We get in there, we do things for him, we do things against him, the enemy's doing his stuff, but ultimately the enemy doesn't have the final say. God does, and he can go, nope, that one's done. We're going to reset and move forward. And it's not that it caught him off guard, it's that he has anticipated these things, because how precise, how much did he fulfill in prophecy with regards to the coming of Jesus? With regards to his second coming, how much more will he? All of these things were called out from before time, and it's just crazy to see how much we can screw things up, but he can still accomplish it perfectly.
Because he is patient.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Now, so let's get back to creation for a few minutes here. So now that we understand this framework for Genesis 1, that we've got, God started a process, and he's bringing chaos into order, and it's his energy that's doing it. And so there we go. It shouldn't take too much longer to be able to get through the rest of creation days, because we understand the pattern, and we start to understand what's going on. So take us through the next couple of verses.
Yeah, so day 1 in the bag. Day 2, now we have verses 6 through 8. God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. Let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and morning were the second day.
Well, now I thought that was going to be easy to get to the next day, but not so much now.
I mean, it's not going to take that long. Yeah, but yeah.
This waters from the waters and the firmament and the heaven, and what's going on there?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing to point out is, defining the firmament, because this becomes a crazy discussion with flat earthers and everything else. But no. Basically, what's happening here is God is saying, separating the waters from the waters. This is not the emerging of land to separate the oceans. This is saying, again, in verse 1, the surface of the earth was essentially all waters. God's Spirit brooded upon the face of the waters, and he is now dividing vertically, not horizontally. So there is, according to this, now the water on the surface of the earth, the water over in the sky, in the heavens, like a dome around the creation, and then there is an expanse called the firmament put in between. This is what we would call the atmosphere, the sky, essentially.
All right.
And before you get too caught up, because I've heard people try to argue that no, this was the creation of oceans and continents, and the firmament has to do with the dry earth. And then you go down and it says, and I placed the birds to fly in the midst of the firmament, and you're like, birds don't fly well in dirt. So again, it's it turns out that you put it all together, it's very clear, whether we understand it, that there was, in the beginning, waters over the heavens. Question is it there? Where? On the far reaches of the universe, or just over the earth? And I think as we get into, we'll see that I think it's clearly looking at over our atmosphere. The outermost layer of our Earth's atmosphere was, as he created it, a layer of water that was suspended.
So when we get to day 3 in Genesis 1:9, and God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. Is that where we see creation of oceans? Is that where that's happening, or somewhere else? Yeah,
so there is going to be essentially the emerging of land, because right now it's all one vast ocean on the surface of the earth. So this is the dry land appearing. One thing that we know is that it mentions in the very next verse, God called the dried land earth, and the gathering together of waters he called seas, and he saw that it was good. So we know that there were seas.
Mm-hmm.
The question then becomes, are seas the same as what we see today as oceans? And you think, well, why are we even asking that question? We can see the earth. Well, it got broke a little bit in a couple more chapters. So the question is, what was the original creation? What was it like? And spoiling the story and without getting too much into it, well, the other thing that we know is that beneath the crust of the earth are vast aquifers, enormous amounts of water, and evidence that there used to be more.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the mechanics we'll see in the flood is it mentions something about water coming up from under the earth.
Oh, indeed it does.
So I think what really we're seeing here is that you have the land appearing. I believe the water under the heavens is mostly under the land. And I think there's still a lot of it there today.
Oh,
So-
it's pretty
yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
My brother-in-law drills water wells
Yeah.
for a living, owns a company doing that, and it's just like crazy because I've asked him because I'd never really thought about it until I met him, and I'm like, where's all this water? Because I know you drill down and there's water just coming out of everywhere. It's like, oh, there's such a vast amount of water stored under the earth.
Right.
It's just like crazy.
Yeah, and this would have been at a scale unlike what we have today.
Right.
Massive scale.
Yes.
And so the end result is that the vast majority of the earth was dry land. And there would have been springs and other things that fed into streams, rivers, lakes, they call them seas here, but nothing even close to what we have in terms of oceans today.
Okay.
And where we'll get into more of that later. But and kind of you wonder, well, how can you make such a crazy conclusion? And I would say that again, getting back to God's purpose and plan. There's a verse that I like in Isaiah that where God tells you why he made the earth and what his intention was. And he says, "For thus saith the Lord who created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it. He created it not in vain. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there's no one else." So getting to this idea of he made it to be inhabited,
Mm-hmm.
how much of our earth is inhabited today?
Well, by people, not too much.
Yeah, and depending on the resource that you look at, there are all different kinds of measurements, but we're talking single-digit percentages of the Earth's surface that is actually inhabited, maybe 10% that is inhabitable.
Well, yeah.
And-
when you think about, if you
Right.
think about now oceans,
Yeah.
we can't live in the ocean.
Oceans, deserts, high mountains,
Right.
and these vast, places that are just inhospitable to productive humanity. That doesn't seem like what God was shooting for when he said he made it to be habitable. And then you begin to look at oil reserves, coal reserves, like all the stuff that we see. I mean, what are oil and coal? Crushed dead critters. So, and particularly a lot of plant life. Those deposits had to either get there over billions of years of things falling and being buried in landslides over and over and over again, or there was a lot more stuff on a lot larger surface of the earth that all got swept up and buried at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that
I
we
wonder-
hear about in history that says that? I don't know.
I wonder what that could have been.
Yeah, so again, we have the same evidence to go out into the world and look at as the rest of the scientists do. The difference is, am I thinking about it from trusting what God said, or am I trying to craft in my own narrative that excludes God because I don't like what he says about how I have to live my life?
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, you look at the facts and you go, one person says, oh yeah, God made this, and then a flood wrecked it. Everything got buried and turned into burnable fuels.
Mm-hmm.
And the other says, oh man, look at the billions of years and the thousands and millions of mudslides and different seasons and changes where this happened real slowly. We'll see why that doesn't make as much sense when you really get into it. But
Mm-hmm.
the net effect is there's a reason to believe why it was mostly covered. And all of this begins to make sense. We see how it's made, and then we see how it broke, and then we go, oh yeah, all of these pieces line up and they're consistent, and that it works. So we weren't there, but God is saying something. We take him at his word, and then we go out and we
Right.
test it, and we can
Right.
see evidence that it was in fact that way.
Yeah. So if we move on, we say, and the next verse is looking here, says, "And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so." And I'm gonna throw something out here that, and I'm interested to your take on it. because I don't think we've talked about this before.
Okay.
The whole idea that the earth brings forth grass and herbs and all these things, so that the earth was created with everything it needed already built in. Mm-hmm. And all God had to say was do it, and it starts growing. So the seeds, and here's the crazy thing, if that's the accurate way to look at it, the tomato that you ate last week, or that I did because I like tomatoes.
Yeah, I'm kind of on a tomato restricted diet right now, but
the tomato that I ate last week comes from the original seed that was in the ground when God created the earth.
yeah.
Now, I mean, I know there's hybrids and there's things that man has done to screw that up, right?
Yeah.
But if you look at seed and fruit and things that come from seed, had to start somewhere. And if it starts with the seed, there it is.
Well, and it's no different than, the seed of the woman. I mean, ultimately, we all come from Eve.
Yep.
So
Yep.
humanity is the same way. Yeah. So God
Right.
created something that was vastly complex, able to reproduce itself, both from plants, which aren't living in a biblical sense, but they're a self-replicating food source, a very complex energy storage device. And, animals, creatures, humans, all of these different elements of creation were designed to flourish, designed to prosper. What's one of those things God continually says, talks about bringing forth, about being fruitful and multiplying. That applies to everything. And so God created, planted the earth, and then brought it up, rose it up, and in a day. So we don't see trees fully mature in a day, but I think it's reasonable to presume that as he's putting it together, I mean, it's like, oh, you really think God made a tree grow in a day? He made the whole thing out of nothing. I don't think it's that hard for him. So but it shows that he did it by, planting the seed, and then the seeds bring forth, and then everything comes to life. And I think there's a reason why it calls that out, because in other passages it talks about the angels rejoicing at the creation, because the angels were made too. And if everything was made according to Exodus in creation, and angels are created, they were made somewhere there in the day 1, day 2 era too. So now they're watching as God's doing this and praising him for it, because now the angels are going to inhabit these spaces also. And so they need to know who God is.
Well,
what
and
God does.
in Job, we see that, the sons of God rejoiced as he was creating the earth,
Yes.
right? As he was
Right.
creating, that's where we see that kind of stuff.
Right.
Now,
And so that's why I say, even though man's not there to witness it yet, the angels are.
Right.
And God's making
Right.
sure that all of the ascendant beings which exist are witness to creation, so that there's no confusion about who God is and about how he is different, because they'll never again see a tree just fly up.
yeah,
But now they know
exactly.
that he is the one who can accomplish such things.
Right. I've always loved the idea, and we're going to wrap this up in just a second here. But I've always loved the idea of this seed, and that God put in the earth everything it needed
Yeah.
to bring forth what he wanted.
Yeah.
Because I think that's actually applicable to us as believers too.
Yeah.
He's already put in us when he says, when he says to Adam, be fruitful, multiply. When he says to Noah, be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, right? So this whole idea of he's put in us as his children, his Holy Spirit, and we get gifts of the Spirit. He's put in us everything that we need, all the seeds of all the things he expects to have a harvest from us. Like he put the seeds of being able of me being able to be a pastor in me before I was born, right? The seeds of you being able to teach and have great depth of knowledge were in you before you were born. And as we mature, as we grow in Christ, those things start to become the fruit that bears out in our life. And so it all kind of feels the same to me, right? Because the seed that's in us, and he's prepared us for a thing that he wants to enjoy for his purposes.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You add to that even further this transaction that happens at salvation. So the seed is put in us; it's planted in us. He's made us for a purpose and intentionally, and then before we know him, it's like our endeavors are fruitless. Like certain things may manifest, we may be successful in certain ways in the world, but you don't really have that satisfied, grateful, just joyful life. You don't have the fullness of life that we were meant to have until Jesus also enters in the mix. And what does he say? He removes the stony heart from within us and gives us a heart of flesh. Well, now the ground is like, that's the Spirit coming in, tilling the ground, so the seeds can actually root and bring forth and have the fruit that come from them that we see manifest in the fruits of the Spirit. So the fullness of everything that he's planted in us is only really realized once Jesus comes in, tills that ground, and gives us a soft heart for that to actually bring forth and and produce.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's what God's looking for. God's looking for a harvest of what He's invested His time and energy in to bring forth what we're supposed to be doing for Him. All right, we're going to wrap it up right there today. And next week when we come back, we're going to pick it up with day 4. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament." And we're going to start talking about all that kind of stuff. So thanks for coming out, and let's do this again next week.
Yes. So we saw the light, and now we'll see the lights. So it'll be good. Looking forward to it.